Hi everybody, my name is Mercedes and my chapter today was chapter 9 called Knowing in Skinner's book about behaviorism, and this is my summary. So first off, Skinner starts off the chapter with explaining babies and the behaviors that they exhibit, and he goes on to say that when they exhibit a behavior, we consider that as we being able to say that they possess a certain type of or certain level of knowledge. And he explains that behavior exists only when it's being executed, and then that behavior repertoire is the set of skills a person has, and in other words, it's the things that they can do under the right circumstances. And just like behavior, knowledge is also considered a repertoire. Next, he breaks it down into the kinds of knowing. First, he explains that what it means to know something, and he explains it as to be in contact or intimate with something. And he goes on to explain that behavior is changed by contact with some things in the environment. And he goes on to say that all forms of knowing depend on previous exposure to contingencies of reinforcement. So that's like the learned behavior that one person gets, and they depend on that known behavior where they know that they'll get a reinforcement if they do something. So that's the known contingency that they're previously exposed to, or they know that from the experience from others. At the end of this section, he goes on to say that knowledge permitting a person to describe contingencies is different than knowledge that's identified with behavior shaped by the contingencies. And next he goes on to contemplate whether knowledge comes from experience or not. He mentions John Locke and other colleagues that placed a focus on contact with an environment, and they focused on why one person should associate the two features that occurred together in a manner, and that how one part reminded him of another. And also they wanted to focus on why it's important to think about these associations. And then all in all, the experience which knowledge comes from is all of the contingencies combined that a person will come in contact with or learn in their lives. And then he goes on to explain that knowledge is power. Knowledge is, in Skinner's mind, action or rules for action. And like he says, knowledge is power. Operant behavior is the exercise of that power, which has an effect on the environment that one is in. Next, he moves into knowledge as contemplation, and he explains contemplative knowledge as verbal behavior where the listener is the one taking action, not the speaker. And Skinner believes that there is room in behavior analysis where there's a kind of knowing that isn't all about action and therefore isn't all about power, and that in this case is contemplative knowledge, where knowing something has weak evidence but there's still a strong response associated with it. And then lastly, he goes on to say about this that contemplation would not be possible if there were not prior contingencies that were all differently reinforced. In the next section, he talks about understanding. And thinking about this, it kind of made sense to me when he broke down what it means to understand. His explanations of understanding, where you understand what someone said if you can repeat it back to them correctly, and you understand what someone said if you respond appropriately. And he also ended up breaking down how to understand something, and that is A, to know the reasons, and B, to know something about the controlling variables, about the things that affect the theory or the situation at hand that you're trying to understand, or even the book that you're trying to understand. It's important to know all the characters, the setting, the current mood going on. All those important factors go into understanding a piece of material so that you can explain it in better terms or even more simpler terms to another person that may not know anything about the material that you are reading. Next, he goes on to say that it's important to acquire deeper understanding, and the only way to do that is through exposure to the natural contingencies that something describes. He stressed that there's the importance of the switch from rule-governed understanding to contingency-shaped understanding. And it's a game changer for behavior analysis because it's very reinforcing, and contingency-based understanding is associated with more naturally occurring events and is observed without bias, whereas rule-governed is just understanding, which is usually contrived and usually suits someone's interests in the matter. And just to summarize his definition of understanding, we as a people will say that we understand something that has been written when we can formulate the contingencies that is described on our own and in our own words, and when we can respond to them independently without having to look back and forth between the material, when we're able to read the material, process the material, and speak on the material in the appropriate manner. Next up is knowing as possessing information. And in this section, he explained what information theory was. And he said that when applied to verbal behavior, it means the message going between the speaker and the listener. And he considers this a version of copy theory, which he explains as the world being internalized through encoding to the point where it's considered as being stored within the body. Kind of like I related this to like transduction between the senses. When you see something and you register what you've seen and as like the color blue. And that's kind of where I got my explanation of how information is used to describe the behavior. First, you have to have the transmission of input to output. And it's just also in verbal behavior, it's the transmission of stimulus to the response. And then the information will start out as an input, and then it keeps changing, going through levels until it becomes an actual response. And it's not always necessary to follow this physiological side of the stimulus, which is how I think, because I am a biologist at heart, because I did major in biology at Mason. And then you have to look at the stimulus and then the response that it leads to as transduction in the operant analysis of the information, which all ties it back to one of his initial comments that because information is a form of knowledge, it too, like knowledge, can be treated as a verbal repertoire. And then he goes into what does personal knowledge of the scientist mean? And then he questions, what does it mean? What does knowing mean? And he says that facts and laws of science are worldly descriptions that unleash contingencies of reinforcement, which then cause success within the human population, because these are learned experience from other people, and it's such like laws and facts, like you will get a ticket if you go over 45 miles an hour. So generally people don't go over 45 miles an hour because they know that they can potentially get a ticket. And he says it's important to objectively separate rule-governed behavior versus behavior caused by direct exposure to contingencies, because the latter is brought on is supported by continuous tests of validity, and it lacks personal bias in the matter. And then he goes on to say that the rules of science, the constants, the graphs, the equations have no actual power within them, but they only exist because of their effect on humans. And then he goes on to say, when more than one person reaches the same scientific conclusion, there is a reduction in personal contribution, which goes on to make a conclusion more valid, because there's less bias and there's less personal opinions involved in that conclusion. His last section that he goes on to talk about is isms. And in this, he states that intellectual possessions that fall under knowledge include philosophy, moral climate, and class consciousness, and that these all contribute to a lot of the behavior patterns seen in people. And finally, that there is power in knowing the contingencies so that we can understand them rather than just know what they are, what caused them, and why these isms caused them. So with that being the end of my summary, that leaves me with my discussion question for you all. And this week, my discussion question is, do you think that there's more power in knowing a law of science, a rule of law, a theory, or is there more power in understanding it? So, a little food for thought for this reading. Hope you guys have a great rest of your night. All right, bye-bye.